Do you need mobile comps for your redesign project?
The answer is yes.
Probably not. The thinking is generally that, okay, well, we have a desktop site, we have the mobile site, most of the traffic is going to mobile these days, so we should, if we can, see what it's going to look like on mobile. That's deeply mistaken because 9 times out of 10, a developer can just take a desktop comp and figure out how to make it work in mobile.
Jack and I totally disagree on this. I think what it comes down to is really more of user experience. And so really to achieve that user experience on a mobile device versus a desktop, what the users are kind of doing in their surrounding environment, I think is typically very different. Obviously, if a user is using the mobile version of a website, they're more than likely on the go somewhere. They're looking for a bit of information that they're trying to get to very quickly and complete an action, versus if they're on a desktop, they are probably at work wasting a little bit of time and kind of exploring, and they're just going to treat the way they experience the website totally differently.
The tricks that we use in responsive design are pretty limited. Things get a little smaller and things stack on top of each other. There's not a lot of crazy variance. There's only a few ways that we're going to solve this problem. Just let us solve it and then have the designer come back and tell us how we can solve it a little better.
Jack says the developers can do it. And sure enough, the dev team at Mess is awesome. That was a wink. They are not designers. They have a fundamentally different skill set. And although there is some overlap amongst the team, they are really focused on the coding and functionality, and sometimes less on the bigger picture experience.
Static comps from a designer take tons of time. It's just, for every page, you're adding a whole nother page. A lot of the times designers don't really know how responsive design works, so they end up trying to do things that are really hard to do on mobile or really hard to make responsive, and we have to go through all these really weird machinations as developers to make this pixel precise composition work when it moves between 50 bajillion, that's not really a number, but a bunch of different screen sizes. The developer can generally do it.
There are many ways to do that and translate things down into a mobile-friendly design, but often that kind of restricts what can happen with even the general look and feel or art direction of the website if you're thinking too heavily about mobile and not having mobile comps.
It's not always true. There are places where if you're doing like an application that's going to have really complex interaction states, where there's a lot of editorial discussion about what's going to be on screen, when it's going to show up, where it needs to be, those things need comps because you need a prototype, you need to clear that. But if you're talking a content-based site where you've got a hero image, you've got some text, you've got some more text, there's like a carousel, these sort of standard layouts that we're seeing over and over again across multiple sites, the developer can figure that out by themselves.
And that's where we get into this area that you hear a lot in the design community. Websites feel so templated. You have a hero image, you've got a 3-up grid of icons below that, then you have like a centered paragraph of text, and then you have like a carousel. And I think the reason that design has moved into that area where things do feel similar and do feel templated is a result of the push towards mobile design. And I think it's also the consequence and result of the amount of money, because obviously the cost of a project is going to go up if it takes our team more time to do it. Yes, there should be mobile design comps. I think there is a mid-ground that we have worked to achieve pretty well, where we can craft those mobile designs by having the designer and the developer work together in tandem without necessarily needing to do 20 mobile specific designs, and that way we can get to that better mobile user experience that ultimately the clients want and the end users want, without having to rack up the cost of a designer going through and spending 3 days designing mobile specific comps for every single page on a website.
Okay, so there's 2 points that he brought up. One is editorial, and the second is the capacity of developers. So first things first, the editorial problem. Nick's 100% right. A good website is going to have different or highlight different information on the mobile experience than it will on the desktop experience. Because you're going to use the site differently. Most of those things are basically best practices though. The developers know, or should know if they're any good at their jobs, what those things are and can take a first stab at that type of editorial based on the desktop. Now the second thing is the notion that developers aren't designers, they have different skill sets. I agree with that. That's sort of my counterpoint, which is that a designer's concept of how responsive design works often butts into the realities of what we can do. And a designer is sort of working in fantasy land. They want everything to be pixel perfect, they have the specific idea, and they're not really thinking about how much development effort it's going to be to get there. A developer, if he's good, he's lazy, he's going to figure out how to take this thing from the desktop comp, put it into mobile, and then the designer can come back and improve it. We don't need comps for that. All we need is a collaboration between the designer and the developer, which we do really well here. Why was that hard to say?
How do you reconcile designing desktop first when we're, literally in a mobile first world?
Oh, that's a way more fun problem. Because this gets to the heart of it. So, okay, desktop first or mobile first, especially because most of our clients, the mobile traffic is generally between 40 and 50% of the traffic. For some clients, because we have a lot of young adult audiences, that is 70%. Why are we still designing desktop first? And my explanation is that it is easier to go from something that is a lot to reduce it down to a little than it is to go from something that's a little and try to expand it up to a lot. You can start off in fantasy land where everything's great, it's a big desktop, and then reduce it down. A developer can do that interactively. If you start at mobile comps, you also have to have desktop comps because it's easy for me to take things away, but it's impossible for me or any developer who doesn't have design chops to add things in. We're going to get that so wrong, it's a waste of time. That's like a weird trip though, right? Like, assuming desktop is a priority, you don't need mobile comps. If mobile comps are your priority, you absolutely need desktop comps. Strange. I think in general right now you can just get away with doing desktop comps and reducing down.
This is one area where Jack and I are going to totally agree. It's easier to subtract than add. I'm a creative, so my head is always thinking of creative spaces, and like a good analogy that comes to me is if you're producing a video, for example, let's think of like a big Hollywood blockbuster movie, right? You're probably not going to start editing the movie by editing the trailer before everything else. I think you're going to get like more of the primary edit to understand what the fuller and richer storyline is going to be, and then subtract down from there and keep calling out the unnecessary things till you arrive at like, what we're going to call like the sizzle reel or the trailer for that video. For those reasons, I think it's a lot easier to start big and subtract and modify what's necessary rather than start small and expand from there.
And I love that analogy, Nick, and I'm stealing it. We think about the desktop site as the movie and the mobile experience as the sizzle reel. This goes back to something Nick said. The mobile experience is more focused than the desktop experience. It has to be. People on mobile devices, at least we assume this, are trying to get things done quicker. They need less cruft. They're trying to get to information. They're on slower networks. They're not sitting on a 30-inch monitor, blah, 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 blah. But this gets weird because one thing that's going to happen at some point in the future is that mobile traffic for some website is going to be a 90-10 problem, where 90% of the traffic is mobile and only 10% is desktop. It might happen sooner than you think, and it might already be happening if you're of a specific type of site. I think we're in this weird spot right now where mobile traffic is growing, but desktop is important enough that it still has to take budget priority.
Like since responsive design really started to come into play heavily, it's probably about like 8 to 10 years ago, right? Like we've seen mobile usage just continue to increase, especially when you're talking about like e-commerce stuff. Like a lot more e-commerce is happening like strictly on mobile devices. It is worth noting that in a lot more developing countries, the mobile usage is so much higher than desktop usage just because of accessibility of mobile devices. I think it's important to take into account that they're kind of paving the way to, I think, some of that future traffic and trends that we're going to see start to come this way towards the US.
Do you need mobile comps? Maybe.
Do you need mobile design comps? Maybe.